All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the US OSS Partner Committee Call January edition. I guess Happy New Year's. Happy 2018. We haven't talked since December. As we promised, we have a couple of speakers for you, starting with Kevin Hillinger, who, like we said, we will bring you a KubeCon attendee. He'll share his experience at the conference, as well as the Microsoft announcements that happened at KubeCon. We also have with us today, Ali Hussein, another cloud solution architect. He will talk to you guys about Linux lifts and shifts, Linux migration, and more specifically, the workshops that are going on right now for Linux migration. So let's just jump right into it. Kevin, are you there? Oh, maybe. Kevin? Let's just give Kevin a second to join us. Kevin, are you there? I apologize for this, guys. Sometimes we have a little bit of a technical difficulty. Kevin is here. We might just be having a little bit of audio problem. All right. Since we have Kevin here. All right. So Kevin, why don't you go ahead and start with the KubeCon announcements?
Fantastic. Let me go ahead and just present my screen here. Great. So as Sarah said, my name is Kevin Hillinger, and so I'll be giving a recap of what went on at KubeCon this year. It happened, last year, 2017. And so I wanted to just provide a summary of what we experienced at the conference. So this year, the KubeCon conference had a fantastic, phenomenal amount of growth at the conference in terms of the amount of people that attended. So there's a lot of popularity, a lot of movement in this community. It tripled in attendance just in the last 2 years alone. And as far as Microsoft's experience and the way that we presented, it was very strong. We achieved a lot of mind share growth during that conference. So the booth got a lot of foot traffic, a lot of attention, and just giving a shout out to our cloud developer advocates who led that initiative, and a great session contributions from Microsoft as well. As far as the technologies for KubeCon, the primary focus was around service mesh technologies. That had a big focus, and that's basically providing a layer of infrastructure between your services and the network and allowing the service communication to be controlled outside your own application code. And then the next one was OCI runtimes. That gained a lot of traction. Intel talked about their Kata containers, as well as achieving OCI certification for things like Kubernetes. And as far as some of the announcements that Microsoft announced during the conference, so Virtual Kubelet was announced. That's a new version of the Kubernetes connector that was announced, and that basically allows Azure to extend Kubernetes to Azure Container Instances and provide customers with things like per second billing, and not having to worry about virtual machine management for their containers. The next thing that was announced was Arc, which is a cloud migration tool. So that basically allows the movement of resources from things like AWS and GCP to Azure. So it's a cross-cloud migration tool. So Microsoft and Heptio announced this partnership for Arc, and it supports a strong Kubernetes disaster recovery solution for our customers who want to use that. The next thing up that was very exciting was Open Service Broker API for Azure. And so this was announced actually December 6th, and it exposes Azure services to Kubernetes, so things like Cosmos DB database for PostgreSQL and blob storage, and more services to come are now supported natively via the Open Service Broker API. During the conference itself, something that Brendan Burns announced during a keynote address was something called Metaparticle. And this is an experimental model for cloud development. And so basically the intent is to boil down all of the different work that developers have to perform and duplicate across the various tools that they work with in the libraries, and condense that down and simplify those tasks for building and deploying container images. The next thing that was announced was Kashti. Kashti is a Brigade dashboard, and if you're not familiar with Brigade, it's basically a pipeline for executing tasks within Kubernetes. So it runs as a service. Kashti runs as well, and it's fully open sourced and supports the DevOps flow in Kubernetes. So you can do things like view Brigade containers and pipeline events within Kashti. There is a demonstration on YouTube of this, as well as an announcement on our open source website. And finally, I did want to mention within Kubernetes, the KubeCon, there was a phenomenal amount of labs and content at KubeCon that not only the people who attended can take advantage of, but also yourself as well. So I provided links to various labs that were provided at KubeCon. So please try them out. And additionally, if you want to watch the videos as well as download the session slides, go to kccncna17.sked.com, and you'll be able to access all the content for yourself as well, and be able to get up to speed if you weren't able to attend. So thank you. That concludes the updates for KubeCon.
Thank you, Kevin. And yes, as Kevin mentioned, we will provide the decks with all the links and all this and everything that you need to go and get your hands dirty. So now we'll have Ali. Ali, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. So feel free to share your awesome content.
Sure. Let me post it in the chat as well, and I will start sharing my screen. Okay. I wanted to take sorry, let me introduce myself. My name is Ali Hussain. I'm a cloud solution architect in the One Commercial Partner organization, and I will be talking to you guys about migration as it relates to Azure. And I took a little bit of a different approach. In the spirit of open source, I created a markdown and put it up on Git so that everyone can follow. Can you guys see my screen?
It is not showing up.
Still saying loading for me. Yeah.
Yeah, why don't you try again to share it, because it's not showing anything right now.
Hello? Sorry,
We,
I got
we still can
disconnected
see
there.
it. No worries. We still can see it.
You can or cannot?
Oh, now it's loading. It's loading.
Okay. Okay,
Let me give the
you
system
guys
a
can
minute.
you guys can still click on the link and follow along, and I'll continue to talk here while it loads.
Yeah, let me.
Hopefully it does.
So it shows a black screen, but I'll go ahead and share.
Yeah, can
the
you
link
go ahead and
to the
share? And
participants.
yeah, yes, it's the same content essentially,
Yes.
and that's why I created this. So, anyways, so let's begin. I wanted to take some time, and it is a very involved topic, and as such, I'm not going to go into the details. I have the way that I've created, or the way that I plan on talking about this is talking to a little bit about the traditional approach when it comes to migration, which is specific to VMs. How do you move VMs from one environment to the other? Traditionally, that's in an on-prem environment in a data center into a public cloud, whether it be Azure or any other public cloud for that matter. So that's traditionally how migration is looked at. But I want to take it a step further. I want to talk about modern migration, which is not just simply migrating the VMs, but taking it a step forward and not only creating automation and DevOps processes around VMs, but then taking this step further and containerizing it, which ties perfectly into what Kevin was talking about around Kubernetes and the different services that Azure is continuously iterating over on open source when it comes to DevOps inside of containers. And Kubernetes for that matter. I'll talk a little bit about tools. Not a lot of time here. I won't dive into it too much. I have provided the links both for first-party tools as well as third-party tools, and the last session is around training. There are a plethora of trainings provided by Microsoft. With different global black belts delivering roadshows around the country, actually. So the links are there. It's very involved content. It's not just content from the perspective of presentations and such. It's actually labs, challenges, and environments that you get to play with and play with. The execution and migration, as well as containers and such. So, so that's what we'll talk about. Let me start with what the traditional migration looks like, right? Which is basically moving VMs applications from one environment to another environment. Traditionally, that is, like I said, in a data center over to public cloud. There are three aspects there are three aspects to the migration. One is the assessment, which is kind of assessing. Actually, let me state the three steps, and then I'll dive into each of them. First one is the assessment of the existing environment. Next is the migration planning, and then third is the execution of the migration. In the assessment phase, you're trying to assess the it's an inventory analysis of your existing environment. With how, for example, how many VMs you need, how many CPUs, what's the disk network latency requirements. That sort of hardware level inventory of getting so that you have a good idea of what you're looking to move and what the scope of it is going to be. And then the second part of that is the requirements, defining the requirements, both from a business perspective as well as application and infrastructure perspective. So, how do you want to actually? Do you want the business to be impacted? Preferably not, but that may come at a cost. So, defining those in the assessment period is critical. Next is equally important is the migration planning. So, there are different aspects to planning a successful migration from one environment to the other. Doing a cloud it's labeled as cloud fit analysis, and what that really means is not every workload is going to be compatible to be moved into the cloud, right? There might be, for example, issues with OS support. There might be certain kernels or certain levels of the OS that may or may not be supported in the public cloud, and as such, you want to account for that and plan around it. There are certain workloads where I/O throughput could be required at an extent that the cloud provider may not provide. And if they do provide, then it may not meet the criteria from the cost perspective. It might be cost prohibitive to migrate that workload. So that's another aspect of it. Maybe there are latency requirements within the application that a cloud provider may again provide, but at a cost. So kind of doing that level of analysis on the type of workloads that you are looking to migrate would be something that should be considered. The next portion is dependency mapping. So identifying workloads, before you can actually migrate the applications or VMs, there is a certain level of there are certain aspects that are required to set up in the cloud, such as identity, for example, monitoring, network connectivity. So before you can migrate the VMs, you wanna make sure that your cloud environment is up and ready to accept the migration. So monitoring is a big one in that you don't want to just migrate from one environment to the other without having especially in production environments, without having the corresponding systems for failures and your regular day-to-day production maintenance and such. And it doesn't need to be just production as well. Also, there is a whole other, or the entire pipeline needs to be migrated. So. And along with that, the corresponding monitoring and tools and technologies also need to be migrated. So that's sort of the dependency mapping that you would need to account for, and then right after that would be assessing the application, right? So in a perfect world, you would be able to execute everything all at once. But that's generally not a good approach, and not only is it not a good approach, it doesn't generally work. So what you need to do next is kind of take a look at what understand the application that you are migrating, and go over what and divide it out in such a way that and not only do you want to identify the application dependencies between applications. I'm not talking about the infrastructure or the tools dependency. I'm talking about the application dependency, i.e. database. In a multi-tier application, there are dependencies between the different tiers, and as such, you want to account for that and plan around it. So that's part of migration planning. The next part is the financial modeling, and I think this is equally as critical. And in a lot of cases, this is where the entire thing could fall apart and does fall apart. And the reason for that is in a traditional migration, cloud, the cost benefit of moving to the cloud is not in migrating just a VM to a VM, right? And apples to apples migration is really not going to generally give you the cost benefit that you might be hoping in moving to the cloud, and modeling for that. So the initial cost would generally be about the same, if not higher, if you were to do just CPU, count the CPUs, count the disk, count the network, and then just move it to the cloud. So there really needs to be two aspects to financial modeling. One is the initial stage cost, which is post execution. How many VMs you have running, how many CPUs you have running, and networking, and then once the entire application and you've executed on the migration in stage one, vis-a-vis all the dependent infrastructure as well as all the dependent application moving to the cloud, you want to optimize infrastructure around the cloud provider. right? You want to be you don't want a static environment. You would want to optimize in such a way that your environment elastically expands and contracts based on the needs of the business. So I think that's a very important point to me, where that kind of gets lost in executing the migrations generally, and that's really where the benefit of moving to the cloud comes in as well. How do you account for that? That entirely depends, and this is not something that you can kind of do. It's unique from an application to application. Not all applications are going to be scaled out in the same way. There are workloads that can be moved from. There are workloads, and the execution on migrating those specific workloads might be similar, but all of application. It's going to be very specific to the engagement that or the application or the environment you're trying to migrate. So there isn't a general blueprint that I or anybody else can share with you that, go to these points and you'll achieve both the resiliency, high availability, but also reap the financial benefits of moving to the cloud. So that kind of sums up. Now there are different tools and the technologies that you would account to do each of these steps. And I'll talk a little bit about them as well. Some are more mature than others, but they come at a cost. So apart from the actual resource cost in moving to the cloud, there needs to be the tool cost would also need to be accounted. And in the first-party tooling, all of that is free from an execution perspective. Actually, let me get to that. That leads me to the next section, which is once you've done the planning, once you have done the assessment, you understand not only the infrastructure environment but also the application, and you've planned a migration strategy. Then you need to execute on that, and that's where the automation comes in. You want a set of tools that will account for each of the different aspects of the migration strategy. And again, there are first-party tools and third-party tools that I'll highlight at a high level, but I'll encourage you to go to the training session, which I'll talk about a little bit later, where you'll get a lot more hands-on experience, as well as much more detailed content around each of those topics. So that's the traditional. This is in a traditional approach. That's really where it ends, the migration, which is you move from a set of VMs. Your application moves from a set of VMs in a data center over to the cloud. But I think moving forward to actually take advantage of the cloud, like as I mentioned earlier, you need to take a different approach. And the different approach is you want to go a few steps ahead of that, which is I've labeled it as modern migration approach, which I'll go through the steps here as well. And again, all of this content comes from the 2 training sessions that the Global Black Belts have made available for everyone, and they are going around the country to deliver, and you guys can partake in those. But again, it's the first 2 steps are the same, right? So which is your existing application running in an on-prem environment, going over to a modern infrastructure, i.e. a public cloud provider's infrastructure. But you want to go a step forward and actually create the CI/CD pipeline and automation around deploying these applications or infrastructure that can, think of infrastructure as code, think of parameterizing your builds. And I'm talking about parameterizing your builds around deploying infrastructure, not only around deploying and configuring applications on the infrastructure, which is the traditional approach in a data center environment. Now, all of that it will differ from a cloud provider to a cloud provider, right? And that's because the APIs or the technologies, even the basic IaaS technologies, for the most part are the same, but they can be different. So as such, you would need to account for, in our case, you would need to account for Azure. And the way that Azure does storage, the way Azure does networking, the way Azure does, CPU or VMs is going to be different than your on-prem environment. And as such, you would need to create the automation to account for that. So that's critically important for the next bit and the next two stages, which is potentially kind of deconstructing your application in such a way that not only take advantage of the cloud services, but also take advantage of the Kubernetes or container mechanism. And that is really going to help you from optimizing on the infrastructure layer to optimizing on the application layer, where you would be able to iterate over your business requirements in such a way without having downtimes, without having and also accelerating on the ability to deliver business logic in an efficient and reliable way. So once you and that can be a very cumbersome process as well. And I think it very similar to how you would approach a traditional migration, which is a stepped approach in taking account application and then testing it out, containerizing it independently. And once that's done, you want to account for containerizing the applications is being able to deploy at scale is quite another. So the next part of the journey of a successful migration from multi-tiered application deployed on VM to a microservices, a containerized application can happen. So once you have tested out the application in the independent containers, you wanna start thinking about how you're going to manage those. And like Kevin and others have mentioned, Kubernetes is one way of managing applications or application containers. It's not the only way. There are others: Docker Swarm, DCOS, just to name a few. And even within Kubernetes, there's a whole slew of ways that you can deploy a cluster, all the way from just VMs to partially managed deployments in ACS Engine to a more managed. It's not fully managed yet, but a managed Kubernetes deployment in AKS. And it's not just a matter of bringing up the cluster, but you also want to be able to create automation to account for failures within the nodes and such. So once all of that is done, and you have the containers deployed, the next step is to actually create the automation within the applications, the contained applications, as well as Kubernetes to lay out a CI/CD pipeline for iterating and developing your applications. So I wanted to highlight, and again, both of these approaches are going to be discussed very heavily in the two Hackfest events that we are organizing. And if you guys want to take a look at those, I'll have those in the links as well. Now, let me talk a little bit about the tooling. There are some first-party tools. Azure migration tool. Arc is going to, which Kevin mentioned, is the second portion of it, which is once you're in the cloud, whether it's AWS or GCP or others, how would you want to move an application deployed on containers on Kubernetes from one cloud provider to the other. But before, that's not always the case. There are, especially in the case or the scenario I've been discussing, that's more, you're moving from a traditional multi-tier application on-prem to the cloud. So Azure Migration Tool is going to help you in that. It's going to do the assessment. It's going to help you do the planning, not all of it. I've listed out, it'll give you an assessment output that you're going to have to go through and account for all the things that I talked about, i.e., dependency mapping, application mapping. It helps you a little bit on the financial modeling, but not. And again, it's in preview. It's in public preview, so it's going to iterate a lot more before it becomes GA. But I did want to highlight that tool. The second tool, which is Azure Site Recovery, which is a DR solution, but it's heavily used. The other use case is heavily used, other than just doing an HA on a VM or an application, is to actually execute on the migration, because it does that. It does that natively with the added functionality of doing doing a back failover. So not just failover initially from on-prem or any other environment into Azure, but also doing the cutover back to once you've successfully remediated whatever caused the initial failure. So you can choose to not utilize that aspect of site recovery and only use it to migrate from one environment to the other, which is what a lot of people utilize that specific service for. So I did want to mention that as well. The other one is Azure Backup. There might be situations where, and I didn't talk about this, but wherever possible, any workload within, if you can build from source, that's probably that is in fact the best way of migrating, right? So that's where Azure Backup and Store Simple may come into play, where you can move your images, you can move your data, and once hopefully within the organizations that you guys are working in or the partners that you guys are working with, there is enough knowledge around the applications where you can, once you have the initial binaries, you're able to deploy and configure the application in such a way that it is ready for production. So that's the best case scenario. You don't want to be doing migrations if you have that muscle within the organization you're working in, which is to be able to migrate the data, and then bring up the specific multi-tier applications and configure them to account for the data. You don't want to be moving binary bits from one environment to the other and then hoping that it's not about hoping. The configuration values within the applications are not going to be consistent. So even if you do the perfect migration, you're going to have to go into the migrated environment and change the relative configuration values within the application to account for the cloud environment that the application has been migrated into. So that's where the Azure Backup and Store Simple can come in handy. And again, these are the first-party toolings, but are not the only toolings. And I did want to talk about some third-party tools, which is Stratazone. Stratazone helps. It's where Azure Migration Tool hopes to be before it becomes GA. And what I mean by that is it provides a lot more bells and whistles around the assessment piece, which I talked a little bit about earlier, where it provides. Now, there are ways of doing similar things in Azure, but it's not as fluid of an experience as it is in Stratazone. So. And if you guys want, I would encourage you to again take a look at the Hackfest, the Linux Migration Hackfest, which has a portion both in terms of content and hands-on lab, which talks about Stratazone. And again, go play around with it, but that think of that as the Azure Migration Tool, which helps in assessments, performing assessments, and even execution for that matter. But the thing that it tries to differentiate in is in the assessment piece. And then Cloud Endure is another ISV application that does the migration. But its claim to fame is the fact that it can perform migrations with zero downtime, and the way that it's doing that, it's doing bit migration from on-prem to Azure in specific. I'll talk a little bit about the last session, which is the trainings. The first training is Linux Hackfest, which migration Hackfest, and if the links are provided, the agenda is there. And again, it'll go. You kind of get an overview of why you're doing it, the different tools and the steps, which I talked in brief about, assessment tools, analysis, and then in the last session, it talks a little bit about what I talked about, which is taking it a step further and doing a modernization of what has been migrated. So that's a one-day event as well. And then the second training I did want to talk about is the Container Hackfest, which for the first bit talks about what are microservices, what are containers, and then in the second bit it talks about it not only talks about it, but you get to play with the Azure services around containers and Kubernetes in specific, because that's the big bet that Azure is making when it comes to orchestration on Azure. They are, if you are in organizations or scenarios where Kubernetes is not the orchestrator of choice, then obviously within the first party there's Service Fabric as well as Docker Swarm and DCOS support through ACS Engine as well. Okay, I think that's all I had in terms of content. Any questions?
So let's see. For now, there are no questions, but stick around, and if anything else, if a question pops up, I'll let you know. But thank you so much, Ali. Appreciate the content. And so let's get back to what are we going to do next month. We have for you a Don't Wait Until It Breaks. We're going to have a modernization of legacy apps with cloud technology. This will be done for partners specifically. It's a specific app modernization campaign focused on you guys. So please make sure to join and register. We'll have the person behind it, Nina Sui, presenting to you. So you can ask her all the questions you'll have. Again, if you haven't done so already, we have specific communities around the solution areas that you should be considering joining: Modern Workplace, Apps and Infrastructure, Data and AI, and Business Apps. And they hold this sort of calls too, and there's always relevant content that might be beneficial for you, so please make sure you check it out. These are the other communities. They're on Yammer. These are the days where they hold their calls on the month. You remember, OSS is the fourth Friday of the month. That's where the February call is going to be as well. Let's see. What else? You know your links, right? You know where our Yammer group is. You know our blog. You know our call. That's why you're here. But if you don't, they're out there for you. Remember, we will share this deck for you after the call, and a recording of the call as well. There's more. Microsoft, OSS at Microsoft, as always. If you're a regular, you know this already. If not, please check out the links. And Vegas. Join Microsoft Inspires Vegas if you haven't. Register today. We do apologize for the technical difficulties today, and I appreciate you guys bearing with us. I know you all stuck out. We do have a question. What was the name of the second migration tool, Ali? If you remember.
The first one is Azure Migration Tool, and you know what? While beauty of GitHub, I will do live edit it and include the link for Arc as well, which is the tool that Kevin mentioned earlier as well as part of my GitHub. So Arc is the tool that was announced at Kevin, was it announced at KubeCon or was it earlier? Either way, it wasn't announced recently.
That's right. Yep, it was announced during that time.
Yeah. So either way, I'll add that link in my tool section as well. But the tool is called Arc.
All right. Hopefully that helps Stephen Colley, who asked a question. Thanks for asking a question. But that seems to be it for now. Thanks for joining, folks. We're going to wrap it up since we don't seem to have any more questions. All right, guys. Thank you for joining. We'll see you in February.